the trip of an adolescent lifetime. I don't know. I guess maybe going to India or the Taj Mahal or whatever might be considered the trip too. But for a teenage rail fan, I really did pretty well. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you some stories about it. And if anybody has any questions about it, please feel free to jump in. But the subtitle: My Teenage Solo Travels by Train to California and Back in July 1967. So I decided to take this slide to make our house in Cleveland look the least inviting as possible to people living in the South. But in the summer of 1967, my father moved our family from Cleveland Heights, Ohio, to the Chicago area to take a new job.
So this is the autobiography of you?
Well, just an autobiography of me for like 2 weeks. So, okay. Earlier that year, one of my father's brothers, my Uncle Dick, had sent us an invitation to visit his family in Palos Verdes, California. My father took him up on his offer, but he only sent me. So if Uncle Dick was planning to see my father and my sister, he got gypped. But anyway, Dad did send me out there. But the really cool thing about it was, as a 15-year-old, he let me plan my own itinerary and then let me take it. So, and by the way, for anybody who would like to see, I brought in some of the original timetables from when I traveled. It may not be the ones I had then, but they're approximately the right years. If anybody would like to see what was going on these different railroads at the time I took this journey. By 1967, the New York Central's no-name overnight train from Cleveland to Chicago was so pathetic, coach only, coupled with a 4:59 a.m. arrival at LaSalle Street Station, that I persuaded my father to let me drive to nearby Akron, Ohio, where I boarded the B&O Chicago Express at 11:59 p.m. in Akron Union Station. So, and even then, the New York Central, when you got off the trains with diners and sleepers, they were pretty awful. The other thing I'm going to mention here too. Now, the thing to keep in mind is I'm a 15-year-old, and there were some other people my age riding trains. The difference between me and them is that they were all riding on their father's passes. So the only time I would ever run into anybody close to my own age was because their father worked for the railroad and they could send that teenager, for free on the trains. So
You had to pay.
I had to pay, yes. I was a full fare passenger. Okay, the Washington-Chicago Express on the B&O. Not a bad train, but it wasn't the Capital Limited. So it wasn't like the New York Central. It wasn't dirty. It was actually old. And, as I recall, I think I was in a heavyweight car. My father did have some limitations. I did get to take some sleepers on this trip, but only a couple. So most of the time I was in the coach. So anyway, the Washington-Chicago Express, we're going to see we'll see a picture of it coming up here next. One of the reasons I wanted to ride it was I wanted to ride something with food service. I didn't read the timetable very carefully because if I had, I would realize that they had taken the food bar coach off in Akron. And actually, they really didn't take it off. They just took the attendant off and closed it up. The food bar was there, but there was no food available. Okay, the B&O Chicago Express was no big treat, especially since it didn't have the food bar coach. I recall that my first overnight coach trip on a train was kind of uncomfortable and not especially interesting. I didn't know to bring a pillow and, things like that. So there were some things I could have done, but since I didn't know anybody my own age who had ever done this, and since none of the adults I knew probably would have taken a similar trip, there really wasn't anybody to ask about it. However, as I note, there may have also been some teenage railfan adrenaline keeping me from sleeping. I was pumped for this trip, and I really didn't want to miss anything.
So is that a picture of?
That is a picture of the train, but in Akron, but it's not the one I rode it at midnight. No, that's Akron was really a pretty big railroad town, and the B&O and the Pennsylvania served a place called Union Station, and the Erie Railroad had its own station, but they were together. So the platform, the B&O, that could be the Erie platform there. The two railroad stations were about a block from each other, and the platforms were on different sides of the track. So there were shared trackage through here too. And I had just missed the Pennsylvania Railroad serving Akron by about 3 or 4 years. So by that time, Union Station had become B&O's station. But that's a pretty good idea what the B&O, Chicago Express looked like. There was a lot of express on it. It wasn't an express train, but did carry express. So we arrived on time at 6:40 a.m. in Chicago's Grand Central Station. Grand Central turned out to exist in a sort of time warp. The B&O, even up to like a year before I came into Grand Central, the Grand Central Station still served small railroads like the Chicago Great Western. It served the Sioux Line. It served, there was probably another one too. No, not the South Shore. South Shore came into Randolph Street. So, well, anyway, those are, sure, the C&O. The C&O came in there also. So, and they had a beautiful, but it said, it was the B&O station, because you can see the B&O on the clock tower. This was one of the nicest looking train stations in Chicago. 3 years after this, they raised it to make a parking lot. To this day, I am told that is still a vacant lot. Chicago really let this. There's a book called Lost Chicago, and it's got all these great places in Chicago that were bulldozed over the year, and Grand Central is kind of a prime example. And for the few years that I was there, it really was my favorite station to visit. It was a great place. Okay, so from there, I am going to head over to Union Station, and I'm going to ride the Vistadome competitor to the Vistadome Kansas City Zephyr for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. And this was the Burlington's Kansas City competition to the Santa Fe Chief. The Santa Fe Chief ran daylight between Chicago and Kansas City, and so did the Kansas City Zephyr. They were both delightful trains in their own ways. At 11 o'clock, I boarded the combined Kansas City Zephyr / Nebraska Zephyr. The Nebraska Zephyr was the same kind of train. It was a day train, and they ran them together as far as Galesburg. The neat thing about the Nebraska Zephyr, and I didn't realize it till I got off of it, was the Nebraska Zephyr is actually one of the original Burlington Bud Zephyr sets from the 1930s. And so it was coupled on the end of it. So when I went in the back and got the photograph, that's what I was really concentrating on. I guess the only reason I'm glad I did not ride this was the Nebraska Zephyr was the only Burlington train that had an automat dining car. Now, for those of you not from California, the Southern Pacific made themselves infamous by running a automat dining car, which consisted of an automat with, I guess it had hot foods, with an early microwave, probably like a what we call a convection oven or something like that. Microwave, okay. Oh, excellent. Okay, good. Well, and they had one poor attendant who, probably was so happy to retire. He basically sat there and made change and told people how to operate the machine, and did this between New Orleans and Los Angeles. It was, and he had nobody else to talk to except if the passengers were friendly. So that really kind of a sad job. And also when he got to El Paso, as long as it was running, they put the Golden State Limited on there, which actually had a regular diner and lounge. So I don't think he did very much after that. But anyway, the Nebraska Zephyr had the automat. The Kansas City Zephyr itself was what I call a pocket streamliner. So it's the kind of streamliner you might see on an HO layout. So it had everything you wanted. It had a locomotive, had an RPO baggage car, had a Vistadome coach, had a coach, and then had a combined parlor dining car. This was the first non-Eastern train I'd ever ridden. So at that time, I'd ridden the New York Central, the Pennsylvania, Erie, Lackawanna, B&O. I'd never ridden anything west of Chicago. So this thing was a delight. What was really even more thrilling to me was a chance to ride in the dome car. And for those of you who are not familiar with the dome car, it's that first coach it's the second car on the train. It's got a glass bubble up on top. You're going to see a lot more dome cars when we get on the California Zephyr. So departing Galesburg, we left the Burlington's main line to Omaha, and we were soon flying along their line to Kansas City. This was not the Santa Fe's main line, but Burlington kept it in pretty good shape. Even today, you can ride Amtrak on it as far as Quincy, but then it's freight service only from Quincy to Kansas City. I guess it's a good overflow for the BNSF's main line if they want to send anything that way. I excitedly took in my first view of the Mississippi River at Quincy, and I guess the only thing I didn't realize I was going to see a steam locomotive, so I probably didn't have it focused very well. But it was really cool to see the Mississippi. First time I'd seen that. And at Quincy West Station, I got off, and Burlington had a freight locomotive there, probably off a local, and they actually switched some cars there at Quincy. Burlington was still handling a lot of mail and express at this time, and we had not seen the point where all the RPO cars had disappeared, although I think they were starting to already by '67. After our 8:00 p.m. arrival into Kansas City Union Station, look at this beautiful thing. For anybody here who has not seen this place, I've got great news for you. It's still there, and it still serves Amtrak. And the people in Kansas City, this thing is really icon for the city of Kansas City, Missouri. And they have passed a multi-million-dollar tax referendum to increase property taxes so that this thing would be restored to an event center. You can go to it now. It's kind of like Cincinnati. It's got a science museum in it. There's a big event space, but it's also still a train station. The trains are not the main focus of this building. It is a showplace for the city of Kansas City. But at that time, it was strictly still a railroad station, and it was a busy place. Unfortunately, I learned that Kansas City Union Station was not a rail fan friendly location. Unlike Cincinnati, where I had been able to go down on the tracks and literally walk around, fly around like a little lark, looking at stuff. This place kept you out of it. So I did not. I was really looking forward to trying to see some of the different other small railroads that went in, smaller railroads, including one Missouri Pacific was one I'd never seen before. But the Kansas City Southern, the Frisco, and the Katy were all still running trains there, but I didn't get to see any of them. So, okay, this says the San Francisco chief, the Santa Fe circuitous route to the Bay Area. I go every time I go through this thing, I think of something I needed to add, and I'm thinking now I probably should have had a map of the Santa Fe Railroad. But basically, what you did on the Santa Fe was you took a big loop south down through Albuquerque, over to Barstow, and then north up to San Francisco. So, but the Santa Fe was such a fast railroad that I think their times were competitive with the Overland Limited in the city of San Francisco. Chris, I don't know if you can confirm that or not. Yeah. Right. Yeah. In fact, you're going to see that in a minute. So the San Francisco, I have a picture of it here, but it was, you talk about a great, in other words, this would be a really fun train to have a model of, because it had the high level chair cars. We're going to see some of those in a minute. Those are what Amtrak now runs as superliners. Those were the models for the superliners, but you also had a bunch of regular chair cars. They went all over Texas. They brought them up. We're going to see that too. And then we're going to see there's a big dome lounge car, a dining car, and then sleeping cars all over the place. So this was quite a train. Here's a scene from my first morning on the San Francisco Chief, having traveled overnight, and it was much more comfortable. I'm in the high level coach. I've got a reclining seat coach with a leg rest and a foot rest, and I'm stretched out. It's so different than the kind of uncomfortable old coach on the B&O that it was really nice. It was also crowded too. I didn't get a seat to myself, but that was fine. So when I wake up the next morning, and as I say here, who knew Amarillo, Texas had skyscrapers? I didn't. So I actually got a little bit of I certainly got a geography lesson here. But in Santa Fe train number 1, and it was number 1 was not the Super Chief, which was the Santa Fe's premier train. It was the San Francisco Chief. It was the only one of the Santa Fe Chiefs that ran over what we now call the BNSF Transcon via Wichita, Amarillo, and Clovis. When you go on this, if you take Amtrak Southwest Limited, which is a trip I highly recommend, you're not going to hit the Transcon until you get west of Albuquerque. So all that, the area that went kind of across the edge of Texas and the panhandle of Oklahoma, and that's all where the BNSF runs their freight traffic now. Okay, good. It wasn't until later in the day during our 30-minute stop at Clovis, New Mexico, that I had a chance to get a picture of the entire train with its classic war bonnet, ABBA lash-up of 4 units. What a pretty train this was. Now, I didn't take more pictures at Clovis, and I will tell you why. I was on a budget on this thing. I only had so much money. And at Albuquerque, one of the neat things about going to Albuquerque today is you can get off the train in Albuquerque, and there are still Native American people that come and set up tables, and they sell stuff that they make and market right there along the train. Well, Clovis had the same thing, but Clovis also had kind of a racket, I think. And I shouldn't say that because I'm sure the people needed the money, but basically if I was running around, I had to get way up to the front of the train so I could take a picture without any Native Americans in it. Now, that really sounds like a cheapskate thing. They would only ask you for 50 cents, but I just didn't do it. So anyway, but I did get a nice picture of it. I didn't take any pictures of the Clovis station, but I'm sure it's probably still there. Okay, this photograph shows the unique mixture of cars on the San Francisco Chief. So you have the high level coach, which again is a prototype for the for Amtrak Superliners. Then you have the big dome lounge car, and they call it the big dome. It goes the entire length of the car. Now, the big dome on the San Francisco Chief was different than the other big dome on the Chief and the Texas Chief when it got one in that, because the area below there, all they had was they just had a bar that sold alcohol and drinks, but they didn't have a complete cafe. The one on the Chief actually had a whole cafe on the bottom, similar to how Amtrak's Superliner lounges are. And then the rest of the train, including the dining car and the sleepers, were all single level. Okay, Clovis was a major junction on the Santa Fe, and it's where the Santa Fe line from Houston joined the Transcon. And it was at Clovis that Santa Fe's California Special, with connecting cars from Dallas and Houston, got to the West Coast. So they kind of competed with the Southern Pacific and Cotton Belt, who had trains that went from Texas to California. And I don't know, the Santa Fe might have been a little bit more direct. So anyway, the two trains were combined with the San Francisco Chief. And while I was standing out there, the California Special came in and had a blue Santa Fe freight locomotive on it. And but when I realized the second thing on it was a Santa Fe PA, a PA locomotive, an Alco PA, I saved my film for the PA. So that was my first shot of a Alco PA on the Santa Fe. And we will see another one before we leave California. Really? Okay. You know,
It's that passenger alcove.
it's that passenger alcove. I've got a much better picture of it, Steve. So when we get to it, I'll show it to you. A couple years ago, the Ford Motor Company realized that their F-150 model truck kind of represented a PA with the long nose, and they actually had a model of it. And I think they might have even run an ad, but there's somebody in the rail fan community noticed it. So anyway, they did all this switching, put the two trains together. By the way, Santa Fe, like they do in Albuquerque, also wash the windows. So again, Santa Fe, just a class act railroad. Going west, the Transcon passed through Belen, south of Albuquerque. And while traveling, I got my first ever look at a significant, but earlier, freight derailment. No chemical cars there, it's all box cars, but when Santa Fe's, you'll realize that when they have derailments like this, especially on a busy freight line, the first order of business is not to unload the cars. They literally will push the cars out of the way with they'll either pick them up with a crane or they'll use a bulldozer. They just want them off the main line so they can reopen the line. My last stop on the San Francisco Chief was Williams Junction, Arizona, where I detrained to connect the Santa Fe's connecting train to Phoenix. This is what Williams Junction looked like. I was there in the middle of the night, both ways, and I did not get a picture of it. But in just a few hours, I saw more trains in one location, the platform at Williams Junction, than I had ever seen in my entire life. Williams Junction, Arizona in 1967 was truly magical. Fast forward. This is Williams Junction in 2010 when Pamela and I searched it out while returning our rental car that we took from Las Vegas to Flagstaff. At population 0, Williams Junction was Amtrak's smallest stop. Today, this small outpost in the high desert is only a memory. What they would do is that in the days of the Santa Fe, when you would go to Williams Junction, you would get off it. And so anybody that was going to the Grand Canyon or going to Phoenix got off in Williams Junction. And so Williams Junction actually stayed as a stop, especially after the Grand Canyon Railroad purchased the Santa Fe's line up to the Grand Canyon out of Williams. I think Williams is about like 5 miles from there. So what they would do is the Southwest Chief would arrive in the middle of the night. It was lit. That was about it. And had a platform, and they send a van to pick you up. Now, unfortunately, the van picks you up in Flagstaff, and so Williams Junction is no longer a stop. A Hassayampa, Santa Fe's mystery train. Okay, this is, I would have had no idea that the Hassayampa was called the Hassayampa, except from, visiting a couple of friends. In those days, before the internet, I actually had a network of pen pals throughout the United States. And you're going to meet 3 of them in the presentation tonight. But the Hassayampa was and I don't know why the Santa Fe took the name off it, but it was the Hassayampa, although it wasn't when I wrote it. But the old heads around there still refer to it as Hassayampa is a river in northern Arizona. It wasn't until our morning arrival in Phoenix Union Station that I was able to get a photo of the train. The Hassayampa was a comfortable, small, streamlined train, albeit without the ubiquitous war bonnet locomotives. So Santa Fe had a couple of freight locomotives with steam generators on them that they would use. But there it is. Now, I'll talk about this again in a minute, but Santa Fe protected the Hassayampa with 1 train set. So, in that southbound, it left Williams Junction after midnight. It was an overnight trip to Phoenix. And then later in the day, by early afternoon, it turned around and was a daylight trip back to Williams Junction, where it turned around again. This was Phoenix Union Station in 1967. Fast forward, in 2023, Phoenix is the largest city in the United States without Amtrak service within its city limits. You have to go to a place called Maricopa, which is about 20 miles south of Phoenix, and they've got a station there, and it's only been, which has been crazy, but it's only been in the last 2 years that Amtrak has started running a dedicated bus service between Maricopa and downtown Phoenix.
Spring training for baseball is in Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking into trying to figure out how to take the Amtrak. And I was reading that they're actually thinking about running into Phoenix.
You know, what they did was, and for those of you who were following Amtrak, one of Amtrak's worst accidents, and it wasn't an accident, it was sabotage. Somebody sabotaged the Sunset Limited west of Phoenix. And the line, the Union Pacific has two lines. They had from between Tucson and Yuma, there's actually two different lines the SP had. One was the passenger line that went up through Phoenix, and then the freight line went down through there. And we're actually going to see that because I was taken down there during my visit. But west of Phoenix, there was no signaling. So somebody was able to sabotage the I think it was a bridge. Well, was there ATS? Okay. Automatic block signals, okay. But they rewired. Right, yeah, okay, thank you for clarifying that. So the track had been sabotaged, but they put it back so that when in the thing, nobody was alerted to the fact that the track wasn't there. It was just this, you know, the lines connecting the signals were still in place. So
Did that had studied the SP that from Kearney, Nevada.
oh,
City of San Francisco. A place with a similar name of Hyder, IDR, in Arizona.
the same sort of thing.
Similar methodology about disconnecting signals and then hooking it back together.
Well, you know, the Union Pacific has been involved for the last decade in double tracking the Sunset Limited because that is one of their major freight routes. And during the SP time, it was a single track railroad with a lot of sidings. And for the life of me, I don't know why they wouldn't just rebuild the line through Phoenix and just operate it with directional signaling, maybe letting the passenger train go in both ways. But they didn't do it. And so what has happened is in Arizona has had no interest at all in any kind of rail service at all other than streetcars in Phoenix. So there's no support. There's been traditionally no support in Arizona. Maybe with the new governor there'll be some, but up till now, there really hasn't been any interest in Arizona. And John McCain was famous for, you know, whenever he wanted to jab Amtrak, he would talk about, yeah, they're welcome to take the Sunset Limit off whenever they want to. So he didn't help very much either. But anyway, the Union Pacific line is still in place from Phoenix to the name of the place wherever it goes back in the main line, but it's not used, hasn't been used for 10 years. And by the way, anybody that knows more about this stuff than I do, please feel free to jump in. That includes the Zoom participants. Okay, thankfully, my rail fan friend, and again, this was via email. I had a probably a group of about a dozen guys that I had made contact with. And the only reason I made contact with these folks, and one of them was my friend Doug, who's on this thing right now, is because I had a letter published in Trains magazine. And in those days, they actually put your address in it. And I had a bunch of guys write me, say, well, I'd written an article talking about, I don't know, I think I was belly aching about something, the fact that the railroad clubs wouldn't let teenagers join. And so I said, well, this is kind of bogus. I was probably about 12 years old when I wrote it, but I had other guys write me. And so anyway, I had a network of friends. So this is the first one of my friends I'm going to meet here. This is Jim Santa Fe Schultz. And Jim was probably a year or two older than I was. I think he may have been a freshman in college then, or he was definitely a senior in high school. But he had his own car, picked me up, and I had a delightful couple of days spent with his family in Mesa. And Jim knew where to see trains, but it was not in Phoenix, because Phoenix was a secondary line for the Southern Pacific, so the passenger trains got there and some freight, but all the big stuff went down south of Phoenix through Maricopa, and the Santa Fe was just a dead end line from the north. So the day that Jim and I spent together, we started off our day of train watching at the Southern Pacific station in his hometown of Mesa. But aside from this local freight, there wasn't much going on, and we moved on to a more promising venue. This proved to be the Southern Pacific's freight-only main line, which bypassed Phoenix to the south of the city near Gila Bend, where we were treated to a continuous parade of SP freight trains for more than half a day. This is the route that is now used by Amtrak Sunset Limited. And the reason that picture is blurred is because those freight trains were going so fast. I'd never seen a freight train go that fast in my life here. It was really fun to be there. And can you imagine running a fast freight train, in other words, blurred again, with a GP20 on the head end? The GP20 is kind of an underpowered locomotive, but Southern Pacific would just put these big lash up of locomotives, and they would just go to town. This GE locomotive was actually a change. I think it may have been the only GE that I got it was definitely the only one I got a picture of that day. Most of the stuff on the SP were EMD GM units. And this short work train with a friendly engineer was hauling a Jordan spreader with a string of waste cars. So what the Jordan spreader does is it goes along and it kind of smooths along the area along the tracks, and if any kind of dirt and extra detritus and rocks and that, it'll pick it up and feed it into those cars behind there. Hanging out on the Southern Pacific Main Line was an unforgettable introduction to Western railroading. I had never seen so many high-speed freight trains in my life.
And so few trees.
And so few trees, thank you. And by the way, for Arizona, again, maybe you all probably knew this, but I didn't realize this. But if you bought a car from a dealer in Arizona, it had to have air conditioning in it, even in the 1960s. And I learned quickly why. Even my friend Jim, with his little Volkswagen Beetle, had air conditioner in it. And it did get hot that day. So this was in July. Okay, the cavalcade of freight trains was interrupted by the surprise passage of Southern Pacific train number 39, the remnant of the Imperial Limited. This used to be a secondary train to the Sunset Limited. And I don't know, I think Jim knew about this. I sure didn't. But it was actually in the Southern Pacific. You'll find it in the SP timetable there. But if you look at the SP timetable, you think the Imperial Limited ran from New Orleans to El Paso and then disappeared off the face of the earth. It didn't. The 39 was a ghost train that didn't show running west of El Paso in Southern Pacific's passenger timetable, but run it did. Carrying primarily mail and express, it also kept its two streamlined chair cars in the consist for hauling deadheading freight train crews. So unless you knew somebody on the SP that would give you a ticket, sell you a ticket, or let you on board, you didn't get to ride this. So, but it was kind of cool to see it because I really was not expecting it. Following day, Jim got me back on the Hacienda, which was now a daylight train on its trek north to Williams Junction. I have since forgotten the name of our conductor. I bet Dave Arthur knows Chris, maybe knows what his nice name was. He was famous on the Santa Fe, but he was the friendliest, most engaging conductor I had ever seen in my limited career. Now, Amtrak has done a really good job of hiring people to work on the California Zephyr, especially out of Denver. And those guys do a really good job of letting you know when stuff's going to come up. It really is a model, should be a model for the rest of Amtrak. But this guy kind of set the stage here. And he entertained the other passengers and me with classic stories about the area, the train, everything else, all the way back to Williams Junction. Now, traveling in coach, and I'd actually, my dad had let me ride a sleeper, so I had my first trip in a berth. The Southern, forgot to mention this. I should have put that, another slide I can put in, but I actually got to ride in an upper, lower sort of thing, and I think I got myself an upper berth because it was the cheapest. And so I had actually ridden in the sleeper going down, but coming back, there wasn't any reason to take the sleeper because the train was operating in the daylight. So, but with the train crew, and this was definitely a single track railroad, so they weren't too worried about me passing another freight train at any speed, and I was allowed free access to the upper half of the aptly named Dutch door. I think I invented the Dutch door on that day. So you can anytime you're on a train and you actually have that sort of thing on there, you can thank me for it. Okay, the Santa Fe's line to Phoenix is rugged and surprisingly scenic, a fact I'd missed out on since the southbound Hassayampa ran overnight. And also very dry. That's a river down there, but you wouldn't know it other than the fact that it looks like a river from a distance. Back in Williams Junction, I bid a wistful farewell to the Hassayampa. This was followed by several hours of Santa Fe mainline train watching until the arrival of the classiest train I had ridden to date, the Santa Fe's Super Chief. The Super Chief, Santa Fe's finest. And this is the consist of the Super Chief, on the day I rode it. And you'll see that kind of a classic thing there, all sleeping cars. And it's got a thing called the Turquoise Room Pleasure Dome Lounge Car. Got a dining car, Fred Harvey service with sleeping cars from Chicago to Los Angeles, Kansas City to Los Angeles. But there's also a little note up there. You'll see June 5th to September 3rd, reclining seat light rest coaches are operated with separating dining and lounge car. And there was a reason for this. Looking at a 1967 Santa Fe timetable, it appeared that the Super Chief, which was all Pullman, and the El Capitan, which was all coach, were separate trains, but they were actually carried in the same consist. The exception was during the summer when the Santa Fe retained enough of its vacation traffic to run them as separate trains. My Super Chief consist ran just ahead of the El Cap physically and carried coaches with their own diner and lounge car. Thank goodness for my father who let me spring for a roomette in one of the sleepers. The Super Chief did not carry berths in that. That was too low class. So I guess, but what a great team. But this is what the train would look like when I moved back to Chicago and I would see it. It would be the high-end car, the high-end El Capitan would be up front, and then the Super Chief would be on the rear. The Super Chief was gorgeous. And all I did was ride it overnight from Williams Junction, like midnight to 8 in the morning. And why I didn't take more photos of it, it baffles me to this day. But I do remember peeking into the Turquoise Room, because one of the deals about the Super Chief was it was the train the movie stars rode. And where did the movie stars hang out on there? They hung out in the Turquoise Room, which was this little room with these wonderful Navajo Indian motifs and, different Hopis and that. And, but that morning, there were no movie stars hiding out from the world or from me inside of the Turquoise Room. My wife, when she heard this, she goes, in Kubla Khan's stately pleasure dome, like something exotic. The last time I got to ride in one of the pleasure dome cars was on the Coast Starlight. And this was Coast Starlight then being an Amtrak train. And this was probably in the 1970s before the Superliners. And this is how lowly it had gotten. They still had the dome on there, but when I went in the Turquoise Room, the crew was using it to store store garbage bags in it. Oh man, I was PO'd. Okay, all right, yeah. So Amtrak did not do well by these. They tried to, they did correct themselves with the Pacific Parlor cars, which unfortunately are gone. But anyway, there was really a nice car, and it was you had an attendant in it, and you had seats on the bottom. You kind of went down there. It was recessed seating, and then you had the dome on top, and then there was the Turquoise Room. I also enjoyed a memorable breakfast on the Super Chief's dining car. Though I rode a number of Santa Fe trains over the remaining years prior to Amtrak, I never repeated my experience on the Super Chief. This photo shows a picture of Santa Fe's other top-tier Chicago LA train, number 20, the Chief, passing the station in Santa Anita, California, 6 miles east of Pasadena. The Chief did not carry any high-level coaches in its consist, but was otherwise a first-class train to travel on. Chief was interesting. It actually, you could ride the Chief, you could get on in Chicago in the morning, and you would be in LA the following night. So it was only one night on the train, whereas the Super Chief, it was 2 nights. But the Super Chief left earlier in the day and got into LA, kind of early in the morning. But if you took the Chief eastbound, you had to spend 2 nights on it. So I never figured out why they didn't. I guess maybe it was the time zone. They just, time zone couldn't do it. So we arrived at LA Union Pasture Terminal on time. It was easily the most attractive railroad station I'd ever seen. So here I am getting off the nicest passenger train, going to the coolest railroad station I had ever gone into. Chris's former office. So you can feel free to tell a couple stories here if you want. Unlike most of the moribund big city Union stations in the Midwest, LAUPT was still a thriving place, being served by true, strong, pro-passenger carriers, the Santa Fe and the Union Pacific, as well as the less than passenger-friendly Southern Pacific. After my Uncle Dick picked me up, I found that this was actually his first visit to Union Terminal since he had moved to Southern California 2 decades earlier, which shows you how many people in my family rode trains. I was it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure that my parents, if they had known about genetic testing, they would have tried to figure out what was wrong with me, because the only thing in my background that would have had me have an interest in trains was my great-grandfather who worked for the New York Central. Okay, while staying with my Uncle Dick and his family, I was able to meet up with 2 more of my rail fan pen pals, Larry Thomas, who was on the left, and Gary Miller on the right. Postscript. There's nothing like spending time with my 3, wish they all could be California girl cousins in Southern California. So one was like 20, one was 18, and one was 16, to discover that my taste in hip clothing, big wide belt, and yellow paisley shirt left everything to be desired. Nobody in Southern California dressed like this. They sold stuff like this to people in Cleveland Heights, so thinking that you can pretend like you're in London or something. Thankfully, my rail fan companions were oblivious to fashion as I was. So, and these gentlemen here, Larry on the right, I discovered through Chris. Larry went to work for Amtrak and fortunately passed away a few years ago. Gary Miller, the gentleman on my left, on the right in the photo, I lost contact with. So hopefully he's still around LA and doing fun stuff. Okay, I did get to take one side trip out of LA, to San Diego, Santa Fe's Surfside Streamliners along the Pacific Ocean. And there were 3 of them each direction. And while in LA, as I said, this was my only side trip, but I discovered the San Diegans were a major holdout for Santa Fe's PA locomotives. So in the next issue of the newsletter, Stephen, I'm going to have a picture of one of the last PA locomotives. And I think I've got a good picture in there, and you'll see how long the nose on this locomotive was. But these were just a big favorite with rail fans. And if you actually got to see them operate and you realize they took over for steam locomotives, Alco was nice enough to give them the kind of engines that produced lots of exhaust, so you probably thought you were watching a steam locomotive. So while I was getting on the San Diego, I was able to see the Lark. Now the Lark, I call the much maligned Lark. Southern Pacific famously put ads in the LA and San Francisco papers telling people the Lark is the bird that couldn't fly or has flown or something. It was something, but it was just a snarky ad saying, why would anybody want to ride the Lark between Los Angeles and California, where you can fly in an hour. So, yeah, but I've got a spiel about the SP later, because I did get to ride the SP. But I want to just point out, this car is actually 3 cars in one, and you see it shares the trucks. This was such a cool car. It had a dining car, a kitchen, and then a lounge car on the other side. So it was really neat to be able to say I saw that. And going back in retrospect, I wish I'd ridden the San Joaquin Daylight, because you can't ride that today. But anyway, the Lark would have been a perfectly good train to ride. And San Diego in 1967 seemed almost like a small town. Los Angeles to San Diego is the rare pass corridor where passenger rail service in 2023 is an improvement over the 1960s. Amtrak and actually the state of California, you can thank the state of California for that, because if Amtrak was running, it would probably still just be the 3 San Diegans. But it was cool. And San Diego was a great place. But I just went down there on the same train, came back, like riding the Piedmont to Charlotte. Okay, the Coast Daylight, the Southern Pacific Silver Link between California's 2 largest cities. Unlike the Lark, the Coast Daylight went in the daylight, and so I guess the idea was that, well, you could still fly in an hour, but at least you got to see some nice scenery on it.
So Dutch, a little more than halfway down, you can see it says San Luis Obispo.
Yes.
That's where I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I lived there from the 80s until 2013, and I moved just 10 minutes away, but I lived in the area.
Well, I've got a treat coming for you then. While I was visiting my friend Larry at his home in Van Nuys, we went out one morning. We actually saw the Coast Starlight go by. So you see a nice long train. And even though the Southern Pacific did not want people to ride the Lark or the Coast Daylight, they did realize that there was a market for the train. And there was no doubt that the Coast Daylight was going to make it into the Amtrak system. And it was an interesting train. One of the things Southern Pacific did was they liked to build their own passenger cars, or they like to take passenger cars and change them. And so this is a great example of some Southern Pacific passenger cars, and nobody else had an observation car with a tail indicator quite like that one. And the other interesting thing about it is that the car right in front of it was the parlor car. It was actually a heavyweight car with 6 trucks. Okay, when it was time to leave LA, my friend Larry actually joined me in my daylight trip to San Francisco. And this above photograph shows Larry standing next to a neat feature on the Southern Pacific's daylight coaches, a chest-high door to load your luggage through. Wouldn't I like to have this on the Piedmont, rather than have people haul their baggage all the way up the steps just to take it and shove it through this little door there. So, hats off to the Southern Pacific, the only railroad I ever saw that had this sort of thing. I'm guessing these cars lasted into Amtrak.
Yep.
Okay, here we go, Jack.
Oh yeah, that's just about.
Okay, so this was my first chance to really get a picture of the Coast Daylight, and here it is. And it's a change crew, and even then today you can get there and you really have a fair amount of time to get out. And they've got some beautiful statuary out in front of the station and that gorgeous town.
There's also a neat little railroad museum just south of the station, about a 1/10 of a mile. That's the old freight depot. Okay. And that's got an HO layout that models the route between Santa Barbara and Paso Robles. So it goes through the whole western grade and everything.
Yeah. One of the things I didn't know about it was until I met Jack was that it was narrow gauge, right? There was a narrow gauge railroad that ran out of San Luis Obispo along the coast. The Coast Daylight suddenly becomes just the daylight when it leaves San Luis Obispo, because it actually goes inland to be able to get over the mountains, I guess.
Right, yeah, it was called the Pacific Coast Railway, and it was a narrow gauge that connected the shipping port in what they call Port San Luis, and it went into San Luis Obispo and joined the main line there.
And when that freight office had a transload thing where they would literally send guys in with carts and they would take the freight off of the narrow gauge cars and put it in the standard gauge cars.
Still on period.
Wow.
That was a while ago. Yeah. An old bridge back in front of it. Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, you get to see the whole train there again. It's just a really a nice train. All right, this is my pitch for the Southern Pacific. In spite of its infamous anti-rail passenger rhetoric, the Southern Pacific instinctively knew how to run an on-time and attractive passenger train. It was like they couldn't help themselves. This was gorgeous. The Shasta daylight was gorgeous. I mean, the only thing that was really the Southern Pacific really gave the axe to was the Sunset Limited. The most interesting car in the Coast Daylight was the Southern Pacific's home-built 3/4 dome car. And it's 3/4, actually it's about 7/8, but you can kind of get the picture there. So again, just a cool car and had a nice little bar and a little, little snack area downstairs.
You know where that picture was taken?
I don't. No, I didn't take it.
Oh, okay. I thought.
Yeah, some of this stuff is hijacked from the internet. Most of these are my slides, but not all of them. It looks like it, doesn't it? It really does. They may have used it as a thing, but I'm gonna let you in on something that you can do today. Fast forward. Who would have guessed that exactly 50 years later, Pamela and I were able to ride in one of these cars on the Panama Railroad's daily commuter train between Panama City and Colon. So you can still ride in this car today. It is gorgeous. And the Kansas City Southern this is the nicest commuter train in the world. The train that runs every day from Panama City to Cologne and then goes back at night. I guess it's Colon rather than Cologne. It probably isn't Cologne because it doesn't smell very good when you get there, but there's a big difference between Panama City and Cologne. So okay, so traveling north out of San Luis Obispo, the daylight climbed the 2.2% Cuesta grade that Jack had just referred to, went around this horseshoe curve and through a number of tunnels. And that's how they got over the what do you call that? Cuesta grade, okay. And actually when you come in, it's really cool because you can see the prison. You go right alongside. I don't know what prison it is. I don't think it's San Quentin or anything. California, okay. Colony?
Yeah, that's what
Okay.
they call it.
You don't want to be a colonist though there, probably.
It's not that.
Yeah, okay.
Charles Manson.
Okay. Okay, so I just want to put in a pitch. Riding the SP coastline along the Pacific Ocean was and is one of the finest train rides in the United States. Pamela and I made the trip from Oakland south to LA in 2014, and she just loved it. And we were so lucky because we had gotten a roomette, a day roomette, and we were on the Pacific Ocean side. We just, you couldn't believe the scenery. Now I am old enough to say that I arrived at Southern Pacific's 3rd and Townsend Street station in downtown San Francisco that evening. In 1967, this was primarily a commuter train station, but it also hosted the Coast Daylight and the Lark. And do either one of the California guys want to give us any background on this station and what happened to it? Oh, okay, well.
It was open when I was there. Last time I used it was in 74.
Okay.
And it was torn down within 6 months after.
So they kept the commuter trains operating up until they made.
Well, yeah.
Oh,
Until then.
and then they moved it to.
You that's the front of the station, the tracks are behind us, so if you keep going outward.
Yeah.
4th Street, that's where the
New station is, okay.
There's a big tall building there now, but there's a Safeway at the bottom of it.
Okay.
It takes the whole block up.
I think it would have been nice to save this, but anyway.
I've got films of trains running in and out of there, but not the
Okay.
actual ones.
1967 was the summer of love in San Francisco. If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. Well, Larry and I had no flowers, and I missed out on the entire thing. But what I didn't miss out on was being able to ride a cable car simply by swinging onto one at a street corner. In those days, cable cars, the locals actually used the cable cars. This is not possible in 2023, where boarding and riding these iconic vehicles is very regulated. You can only go to certain stops. You have to queue up. And based on my experience there, you're going to go there, and unless it's like really just awful weather out, you're going to sit and watch about 3 or 4 cable cars go by before you'll finally be able to get onto one. I'm actually surprised they still let people even hang on to them, but anyway. I also enjoyed riding over parts of San Francisco's extensive streetcar network. Amazingly, you can still ride one of these PCC streetcars to Fisherman's Wharf in 2023.
Those were Shaker Rapids transit companies that were sold to San Francisco.
Yep. Yeah, so maybe sometime we'll talk about PCCs. I don't know, PCCs really didn't make it into the South. I'm trying to think of a southern city that had them. El Paso had PCCs, didn't they, Charlie? Yeah. Dallas had some, okay. And Dallas, okay. Anyway, it was the President's Conference Commission, and they designed nobody could agree on streetcars. It's like electric vehicles now. Nobody seems to be able to agree on chargers and that, but they came up with this model, and they made these things. I grew up as a kid riding these in Shaker Heights. So. Okay, we're getting ready to head back to the Midwest. The California Zephyr, Western Pacific, Rio Grande, and Burlington Silver Lady.
So you went through Caddy Line.
I didn't get a picture of it, unfortunately. I should have thrown one in. But okay, so my trip back to the Midwest started by boarding motor coach in San Francisco's Transbay Terminal to Oakland. Here I was transported to the California Zephyr at the Western Pacific's Middle Harbor Road station, which as far as I could tell was an unsheltered boarding area in Oakland. So what they did was they brought all the San Francisco passengers over, boarded them, and then went a few miles to the east and took them to this station here. And this building still exists. I think it may be a restaurant now. It's had a couple of different iterations, but I just figured Oakland would have just like, one station, but it actually had 2. So leaving the Bay Area, the Zephyr began its eastward trek through the foothills of the Sierras. Just outside of Oroville, we passed near the Oroville Dam, which was still under construction at that time. During the crew change at Oroville, I was able to get this shot of the entire train. You can even see the last dome car back there. I would have never guessed that almost 50 years later, my son Kyle would marry a young woman from Oroville. So when she told me she was from Oroville, I said, oh, I've been there. And you can see I actually did get on the ground there. So this diner lounge car from the recently discontinued Prospector, which was a train that the Rio Grande Railroad ran overnight between Denver and Salt Lake City, was a colorful addition to our consist. I really believe that this is one of the nicest color schemes I've ever seen on a passenger car. The stainless steel and the orange paint and that. It was a gorgeous car. So just California Zephyr had 5 dome cars on it. Count them, 5. They were listed in there. And just about any seat in one of the California Zephyr's 5 dome cars was the best seat in the house. Soon after Oroville, we entered the Feather River Canyon. The Western Pacific runs through it for 42 miles between Pulga, east of Oroville, and Ketty. And more Feather River Canyon, and still more Feather River Canyon. And finally, cresting the rugged Sierra Nevadas. Check out this parade of F units getting ready to push a freight train at Portola. I think they have 6 locomotives on there. and passing more Western Pacific freight trains. And I think these trains were all kind of stacked up, waiting for the California Zephyr to get out of their way so they could start running them again. Western Pacific, like Southern Pacific, was another single track railroad. And the question I asked myself then, and I still ask myself today, is there such a thing as a scenery overdose? The next morning, I woke up early to photograph the changing of the guard at the Rio Grande station in Salt Lake City. And that was where the Western Pacific locomotives came off and the Rio Grande put their units on it. The Western Pacific took more of an interest in how their locomotives looked than you can see the Rio Grande did. Also did a better job of running it on time. We're soon climbing up through Soldier Summit, Utah on the Rio Grande. This is all a trip you can take on today's California Zephyr. All I can say is don't miss it. It is gorgeous. It really is. Another crew change allowed me to get a photo at Grand Junction, Colorado. Except for the Rio Grande F units, this scene looks remarkably the same in 2022 when you go down to this part of the station. Fast forward. This is the classic 1906 Rio Grande station in Grand Junction in 2018. It's been under renovation for the past 2 decades, and it's probably still under renovation right now. Okay, good. You see, they got building materials, everything. I guess they just sit out there. So it is a gorgeous station. I don't know why they can't. Yeah. Yeah. So we're now heading towards the Rockies. There they are in the distance. And I'm in the 4th dome car, and there's still one behind me. By midday, we were running at least 2 hours late. So we didn't get to pass the Western California Zephyr and Glenwood Canyon like you see so many pictures. This shows us passing the Zephyr, I believe, in Rifle, Colorado. Here we are running adjacent to the Colorado River and Glenwood Canyon. For years, they had a plaque. The Vista Dome car, which is what I was riding in, was invented by, I want to say was it an engineer for EMD or Bud? Was one of them. Had an idea. What an idea would it be to put a glass top on a top of a passenger car. And so they had this thing along the highway. I think that was Route 6 for years. And a few years ago, about a decade ago, I was in the Golden Museum, Colorado River Museum, and there it was. They'd moved it there. I guess it was probably too suspect to getting vandalized. Oh, was it? Okay. Yeah, you can imagine if you're a rip-off rail fan, you want that in your basement. Okay, here's the Silver Lady pausing for its last crew change at Bond, Colorado. What a gorgeous, gorgeous train. It really was a first-class train. These trains were all different. The California Zephyr was not the Super Chief, and the Super Chief wasn't the Coast Daylight, and the Coast Daylight wasn't the Denver Zephyr, but they were all wonderful and staffed and manned by people who really took an interest in them. Here we are passing a Rio Grande freight train near the end of daylight. It was well past sundown. We finally arrived in Denver. When you come to Denver, and this is still true today, what you'll do is you're going to be up in the mountains and you are going to go through a series of loops, and you're going to go down to Denver, and it looks like you're flying into the airport there. It really is a wonderful entrance that the Rio Grande makes into. And when you leave, when you go the opposite direction, I'm going eastbound. You go westbound, you leave Denver in the morning, and boy, you look and you think, oh gosh, I'm going to miss that. But you don't miss it, because what happens, the train turns around and suddenly you're looking at it from where, where the other person on the other side was seeing it just a minute before. Postscript, the California Zephyr. 3 years later, in 1970, the Western Pacific successfully petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to discontinue its portion of the California Zephyr. The remaining train, called the California Service, wasn't much of a name, was it? It was like Northeast Corridor. What do they call it? The corridor. What do they call the Virginia trains? They don't even have to call them Virginia trains. Northeast Regionals. Just really not a very imaginative name. It was called the California Service in the Burlington Northern Timetable. It ran tri-weekly from Chicago to Ogden Union Station. There, riders for points west and their baggage made a cross-platform transfer to the city of San Francisco. The California Zephyr name and through routing was reestablished by Amtrak in 1983. So this is a picture of these slimmed down, but the Rio Grande kept a consist of the California Zephyr, and this was run for years as a train called the Rio Grande Zephyr. And boy, was that a neat train to ride until they finally left the business.
Was that the ski train?
No, that ski train was separate. The ski train was really cool because the ski train ran with 1930s nickel plate passenger coaches that they had made into commuter coaches, but they used to run them. They ran them in the 1950s on the nickel plate St. Louis train. But and now the ski train, I think they send superliners out there. Okay, the California Zephyr was almost 3 hours late arriving in Denver, which caused me to miss my connection on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy's unnamed Denver Billings local, or even out to Greeley on the Union Pacific's Portland Rose. But this photograph shows my next host, another pen pal, rail fan friend named Dean Modis. Dean lived in Greeley, Colorado. The following day, Dean borrowed his mother's car, and we took in what I call the Day of Railroad Delights, which was going to the Union Pacific shops in Cheyenne, Wyoming. This is a U-50 5,000 horsepower diesel electric. Only 23 of these locomotives were built, 20 for the Union Pacific and 3 for the Southern Pacific. So this was sitting there. This was another thing. This is a Union Pacific GTEL gas turbine locomotive. And yes, this thing sounded like a jet engine taking off. There was a train going by with one of them on there, and it sounded like a plane, taxiing off the runway. It was just revved up. And Charlie, did you ever get to see one of those?
Yes, sir. That's the ride.
Oh my gosh. Do you have anything you want to add to that description of them?
They were worth seeing.
Did you have to wear headphones on the engineer's compartment, or?
So that was the first version. The second version, they turned it into a veranda so that instead of walking inside to
Okay.
maintain the engines, they cut it out so that
Oh.
you're walking on a veranda like a.
They probably had people going deaf walking through
That's
the.
why they did it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so here you go. Now I'm going to add it, and I'll change this first version of the gas turbine locomotive. Thank you, Jack. Look how nice that tank car looks for the diesel fuel. Imagine, it's hard to imagine something looking that good on Norfolk Southern these days. Bonus, I had never seen one of these parked in any railroad yard in the East. This is Union Pacific Locomotive 833, a Northern Class 484, which is now stuffed and mounted at the Utah State Railroad Museum in Ogden. This thing's just sitting out in the yard. I mean, I'm walking around this yard seeing these exotic diesels, and all of a sudden, this thing's just sitting there. It's just amazing. The New York Central and the Pennsylvania area, they'd send all that stuff off to the scrap yard when I was growing up. This was taken inside the Union Pacific Steam Roundhouse in Cheyenne with permission. I can't make a point to just tell you how friendly and inviting the Union Pacific, the people running the Union Pacific were. They just were really nice. I'm sure you can't do this today, but we were able to do it then, and that's a big boy 4884, saved from the elements. It's now in display in Kennefic Park in Omaha. And I also got to see an old friend, and I say an old friend, I'd never met this friend, but I certainly knew about this one. I looked in the roundhouse window, and there it is. Wait a minute, I know you. Just about every rail fan in the late 60s was familiar with Union Pacific's famous 8444. It was the last steam locomotive built for the UP in 1944 and was a 484 class. Now, this is the combined City of Los Angeles, City of San Francisco, Challenger, City of St. Louis, a train which affectionately was known as the City of Everywhere. We caught up with it being serviced in Cheyenne's UP station. And kind of like the Rio Grande, I guess the Union Pacific really didn't care what the locomotive in front of it looked like, because this one had obviously been pulled out of the paint shop. I never really was sure why they were running it. And there was also kind of a surprise behind it. Not only did it have this STP-40 passenger locomotive, and the only difference between this and an SD-40 was that it actually had a steam generator in it. But the Union Pacific had seen that the end of the passenger trains were going to come. And the Santa Fe was kind of the same way. So what they did was they went out and bought freight locomotives that when the passenger trains finally disappeared, they could just take the steam generators out and make them a full freight locomotive. That's actually, I think that's a FlexiBand car behind there. So again, the UP just did not really care as much about what their train looked like as the others. Not to say there wasn't a very nice train on the inside, but the UP was the one major railroad I did not ride while I was there. Okay, we're just about done. The Denver Zephyr, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy's speedster to the Rockies. Unfortunately, when I rode this thing, they did not have the section that continued on to Colorado Springs, although they did have a connecting bus. But this thing was a pistol. It didn't have a pleasure dome car, but otherwise the Denver Zephyr was a worthy rival to any of Santa Fe's trains. To me, it was a perfect passenger train, carrying a chuck wagon lunch car, as well as a full diner. It also had an economy slumber coach sleeper. The slumber coach was this really neat thing where you could get a room that was like a roomette, a little bit smaller, but you could get it for your coach fare plus like $25. So this was great. I mean, when you're a teenager, a college student, you can actually ride in a sleeping car, and you're not giving a month's paycheck like some of Amtrak's trains out west now, depending what time you ride them. It was just it was nice to see economy sleeping locations, and it was ended with this gorgeous blunt end dome observation car. As we departed Denver Union Station, I had a quick look at the Burlington's Denver to Dallas, Texas Zephyr, which, like the Nebraska Zephyr, still utilized 1930s area Budd articulated train set. UP was going to get some mileage out of their Budd sets, and they did. So this photo shows me on the last leg of the trip. This is taken from the rear window of the observation dome car on the Denver Zephyr. Next stop, my new home in suburban Chicago. My last train ride of this epic adventure was the Chicago Northwestern Scoot, a push-pull bi-level commuter train which dropped me off near my father's new office on the north side of Chicago. Postscript. Looking back on my sojourn, if I were a 15-year-old today, I couldn't begin to replicate this feat, with Amtrak now requiring written parental accompaniment and/or permission for each leg of the trip. So in other words, if a 15-year-old comes to the Amtrak station in Burlington and their parent has signed a waiver, it doesn't make any difference because the waiver has to be signed in front of an Amtrak employee. And even then, you have to, accompany them to each station. So you just couldn't do it. You just couldn't do it unless somebody didn't ask what age you were. While a good portion of my trip can still be taken via Amtrak trains, a significant portion cannot be. Here are the trip segments that no longer have scheduled rail passenger service over them. Akron to Chicago on the B&O, 722 miles. Quincy, Missouri to Kansas City, 203 miles. You can still go to Quincy on Amtrak, but just not be on there. Emporia, Kansas to Baylin, that's the Burlington Northern Santa Fe's Transcon, 550 miles. Williams Junction to Phoenix, BNSF still goes down there, and actually they've done a nice job. The line has been rebuilt, and I think it sees a fair amount of traffic on it, but no passenger trains. And finally, Oakland to Elko over the former Western Pacific. Amtrak now uses the Western Pacific between Elko and Salt Lake City, but not beyond there. So these segments that you can't ride today represent 2,360 miles, or 35% of the total 6,678 miles that I traveled in the summer of 1967. Thank you for sharing the memories of this trip with me in 2023.